Like, do you even know who you are? I am black, biggity black, American, yes, but bigger than that. Spitting opinions, rooted in facts. Hope you aware the culture is bigger than plats. Used to be a
I'm Ikhlas Salim. I am creator and co-founder of a podcast called Identity Politics, and it's a podcast on race and gender and Muslims in America. We actually started back in 2016, and then actually we are ending the podcast this year. So we had a good run for a few years now, me and my co-host, and we just decided to wrap it up. But for years now, I've been hosting and trying to create space for conversations along race and gender, specifically within the Muslim community in America. And, you know, anybody who's a part of any identity group, right? You know that just like even sticking within your own identity group, all of the politics that come out of that and all of the challenges and the beauty that can just come with even talking within your own identity space. And so today we're actually expanding that, talking about Black Asian solidarity and this panel where we're focusing on othering in Black and Asian cultures. And just for those who may have been hopping in and not sure what the panel is about, I'm just going to read that description for us. So anti-Black rhetoric and white cultures can be relatively easy to identify. However, anti-Black sentiments can be found in Asian cultures too. And this panel will explore how Blackness is depicted in South Asian and AAPI cultures and strategies to combat those stereotypes. We'll explore the positionality of AAPI people within Black America and the economic interdependence of Asian businesses and Black American consumerism. And so on the panel today, we have some wonderful panelists. I'm just gonna read just a couple short bios of each panelist, and then I'll give the panelists space to add anything else that you would like to add as your introduction. So first we have Roseann Liu. She's an assistant professor of education studies at Wesleyan University. Drawing from critical race and abolitionist frameworks, she teaches and researches about structural inequalities in education, including its effects on communities of color and the organizing strategies used to enact change. She writes about the pitfalls and possibilities of progressive pedagogy, multiracial coalitions, and liberal teleologies. That's like a new word for me. So you'll have to, when you share a little bit, you'll have to talk a little bit about that. Okay, and then we have Bakirathi Nani, and she's a professor in the Department of English Literature and coordinator of the Gender and Sexuality Studies program at Swarthmore. Manny is also a curator of South Asian diasporic visual cultures and regularly collaborates with artists, academics, and activists on public events with Asian American arts organizations in Philadelphia. She's the author of 2 books in Asian American Studies, Unseeing Empire, Photography, Representation, South Asian America, published by Duke University, and Aspiring to Home South Asians in America, and that's a Stanford University Press. Themis, and that's, I have in parentheses here your YouTube name, your alter ego. He studied political science, international relations, and sociology at a university in Atlanta, Georgia. Later, he went to China for grad school, where he studied international and Chinese law. His thesis was a comparative study of Chinese and American approaches to due process. And apparently that's a really long story that he'll speak about in depth, maybe at some other point, maybe not today, but if you're interested, you can always follow up. And Themis later went to DC to study for his JD, then later took and passed the New York bar. He has a YouTube channel, Themis and Thoth, with an accompanying blog by the same name, where he does political and cultural commentary. So that was a mouthful, but important to state where people are coming from in this work. So we did want to share that so the audience has that information. And then now I just want to open it up to you if there's anything else that you want to share as an introduction to yourself for our audience today. And then another question I have for you to add on to that is what brings you to this work specifically? So I will start with Themis.
All right. So I'm a corporate attorney. I don't know how I have time for this, but not this, but like just work outside of law generally. Just wanted to add that because this is like a long lunch break for me. Separately, when it comes to the sort of anti-Asian sentiment and anti-Black sentiment, I think they are both kind of derived out of similar beginning, except for slavery. So when we talk about the othering, for example, which is where I'm going to start, and then we can get into some more questions. When we talk about othering, I think that it requires a kind of power to other someone, right? Or other a group, which is not just saying you are different from me, but you're also less than me. And so one of the questions I always have is, who has power and how do they use it? And when it comes to whether or not there are sort of anti-Black sentiments in the Asian community, the answer hopefully is just yes. When there are anti-Asian sentiments in the Black community, similarly, the answer is yes. But can the group that I identify with, which is Black, which another story about kind of how big that group is and what it even means to be identified as Black. But what that means for me is that we as a Black community cannot other the Asian community because we don't have the political, social, or even economic power to do that. But there are sort of discriminatory approaches to the Asian community. And so I wanted to study that, which also led to me going to China for a bit. But so that's how I kind of got introduced through sociology, trying to understand the relationship and why there is a wedge between the Black and Asian community, and trying to figure that out. So that's kind of how I got into this space.
For sharing all of that. And I'm sure we're going to circle back to everything you just laid out. Roseann, do you want to share?
I think for me, a lot of the impetus of my interest in Black Asian solidarities comes out of my personal histories, right? So my mom, I think growing up, made me very politically aware of anti-Asian discrimination, and gave me some sense of, I think she reached middle school, right? So with her limited formal educational training, she still really tried to instill in me this sense of, an awareness of colonization, right? So she comes from Macau, which is one of the longest Portuguese colonies right near Hong Kong. And so she would, tell me stories about that, and also tell me stories about when she was a recent immigrant in the US, right? But I think as I grew up and as I had maybe more of a comparative lens for understanding these issues, it bothered me that so much of kind of this Asian political movements and activism sometimes really relied on anti-Blackness, right? And so my work, I guess a lot of it was just sort of wanting to address those issues within my own community, and and not even just my racial community, my ethnic community, but even within my own family, and particularly I think with my mom.
Sharing that, and then please correct me if I'm wrong because I've lost it. But is it Bakirathi?
Yeah.
Okay.
No, I appreciate, the opportunity of being in conversation with all of you today. Roseann and I are colleagues at Swarthmore College right now, where Roseann will be leaving to join Wesleyan. But I've been teaching Asian American Studies at Swarthmore since 2002. And one of the things that draws me to, teaching comparative and critical race and ethnic studies is to think about these histories of solidarity between differently racialized, gendered, and sexualized groups, right? And also between different groups who experience different histories of gender and class. So I think that there is a way in which we might think, looking at sort of more recent events in the United States, that, as Themis was saying, that there is this wedge between Black and Asian communities, right? But then there's also this other kind of older history of solidarity movements, right? In the 1940s, 50s, and 60s that tied together nations in Africa with nations in Asia for decolonization. That refers, I think, in part to one of the, some of the histories that Roseann cited, right? So I'm really interested in the ways in which these kinds of histories of solidarity disappear or are obscured in our contemporary moment, I'm not saying that it's necessary to resurrect those histories wholesale, but I think it's important for us to know what kinds of histories of solidarity were there, what kinds of possibilities of solidarity are possible, and how we can get there.
I think let's start there, right? Because I think that came through your introductions, and it's something that I immediately thought about too, when being invited to moderate this panel, where I just was thinking, and this is something that I talked about in our podcast a lot, and used this statement that, you know, all my skin folk ain't my kinfolk. And just looking within the Black identity itself, right, you have multiple layers, right? Like Black people that are native to this country, immigrant, class, all of that. And so then when you look at Black and Asian solidarity, you also see that that exists. And so I'll say all my skin folk ain't my kinfolk, in the idea that I like to think about people as like melanated people versus non-melanated people, you know, people of the sun, and just thinking how growing up as a child, I grew up in a predominantly Black community, but that were dominated by Asian businesses. And so these were businesses that I frequented regularly. And the expectation was that, like, yes, I expected racism from like white people when I entered white spaces, but then I'm going into like the beauty supply store or like to get my nails done, and then constantly having this like tension of going into these businesses and not feeling welcomed, right? And then hearing about people who have been attacked physically or verbally and all of these things. So living at the intersection of this tension, where you have like the ideal, right, that we would be in solidarity, but the lived reality being very different from that. And so I want to pick up, Bakirathi, what you said, that there is a history of solidarity, right? But that has been broken. So let's talk about that a little bit, of anything that one of you would like to share of what do you see as the root cause of breaking this history of solidarity and what we see now. Or if you have a different opinion, right? Because some people will be like, solidarity is there, it's just not being covered, right? And like the tension is being highlighted. So I think those are 2 points. If you do think that, you know, there's a difference between solidarity between that period of 40s and 60s and what we see now, what is the root cause of it that you see?
Well, well, should I go?
I left it open, but I can do cold call,
so,
you know, if you prefer to do
cold
that.
call. So I think there is a lot of history, just if we look to the civil rights movement, for example, onward, but even backwards from there, right, ex ante, we can talk about kind of the change in the Asian imagery that came about. And I think the model minority, I'm going to call it, refer to it as a myth, but the model minority myth, I think, is a fundamental part of why I and a lot of historians agree that it's very difficult for someone who benefit but not quite sure how they might be losing out on fully being represented and seen as a person, would want to disabuse themselves of a myth that they think help them, right? So I'm reminded, when it comes to solidarity, of this really famous picture of, I think her name was Yuli Kochiyama, cradling Malcolm X's head after he was shot. And I think that was, I mean, a really sad moment, but it also exemplifies this kind of coming together in a way that, and she was a follower of Malcolm X. She was born to Japanese American parents. And so that was, I think, a moment where we saw people who were seemingly different on the outside working together to say, white supremacy is bad. We are going to try working as a group, regardless of race, to go against it. But I think what happened, right, in the 1965 with the new immigration bill was that there was the model minority myth was a geopolitical tool, right? It allowed for the US to have relations in Asia after the horrendous treatment of Asians in America, right? And we were on the precipice of another global war. And so they were trying to kind of ally themselves with different countries in Asia, particularly China and Japan, well, China particularly. And so we got this huge propaganda scheme going out at the same time, talking about Asian American and Asian being the model minority, and that they are docile and all kinds of things that are actually harmful to the Asian community. But there were good things too about their scholastic achievement and all of that, while putting in place the immigration policies that allowed for people who met the criteria to come to the United States to fulfill the model minority myth that was already created, ignoring there were tremendous war in South Asia and the refugee crisis, right? And Asian refugees who also were coming to America at the same time, having to also adopt to our claim that model minority myth that did not apply to them. And so it brings up a lot of interesting questions, but who would not want this kind of radical makeover? We left from the yellow peril to the model minority, right? And it did in a lot of ways help Asians acclimate and be accepted. And so there was this kind of movement away from the Black community and solidarity, I think particularly during the civil rights movement, where the 1965 Civil Rights Bill allowed for people, myself included, being an immigrant, to come here and be not discriminated in terms of work, at least not overtly. And so, I think there's a level of credit that needs to be given to ADOs who did that work, but also a recognition that the model minority myth is helpful and also harmful. But I think it would take a lot of introspection to say, okay, I am being talked about as being smart and great and not confrontational. I don't think that is true for all of us. Let's talk about white supremacy. I don't think a lot of people are willing to do that kind of analysis. I'm done.
Roseann or Bakirathi, one of you want to jump in and add anything to this or
Sure.
respond?
Could you just repeat the question again? It was about whether solidarities are still here and what. Okay.
Yeah, and well, I can also, you can speak to that, but the question too was, Bakirathi had mentioned that there was solidarity during this 40s through 60s period, right? And then you kind of see a break in that solidarity. And so like identifying what is the root cause of that break, and then why do we have the tension that exists now today?
Yeah. So I think I think that to the extent that we understand and we can mobilize some of these histories, right? The solidarities are still present, but I guess I'll also speak to some of the tensions that you raise in your neighborhood growing up. And so I know one of the participants have mentioned this op-ed that I wrote for the Philadelphia Inquirer. So a couple of years ago, there was a city council bill that was passed in Philadelphia that sought to regulate stop and go stores, right? So many of the stores that you have referenced that are owned by small Asian small business owners, right? And so the law was directed at basically requiring them to take down the glass, the plexiglass that oftentimes separates the customer and the owner, right? So many people saw this as sort of just, it's very disrespectful, right? It's like, speaking of othering, that's like a very symbolic and material symbol of othering, right? And so it sort of catapulted some tensions that have, oftentimes existed in Philadelphia, but between the Black and Asian American communities, because a segment of the Asian American community, I definitely won't say all, but a segment of the Asian American community felt like it was putting their lives in peril, right? That they would be hurt from the passage of this law, while other people, including some council people, had rightfully said that this is hugely disrespectful, especially when you are earning money from the Black community. And so the op-ed that I wrote just tried to trace some of that history, right? and bring it back to that. And so this is where I think, the extent to which we can be in solidarity requires us to understand these histories, right? And kind of the foundations of this country, right? So when emancipation happened, right, it left an economic vacuum, right? And, obviously not all, but that was also a big push for immigration from Asian countries. And so, so at that time, there were these plantation commissaries that inflated the price of goods, right? So slaves or former slaves were, in order to basically keep them in debt, right? The price of all these goods were heavily inflated. And so in the Mississippi Delta region, and folks from the Sayep region, so one of the early Chinese immigrants, came in and basically, I guess took advantage, right, of that situation and created these stores that sold to formerly or to emancipated slaves, right, and were at a rate that was lower than what was being sold in the plantation commissaries, right? And so a lot of that history, I think, is still, this should all be familiar to us, right? Because it sort of calls to mind a lot of our recent history and the way that contemporary society is also set up, right? So that, it's very necessary for us to understand these histories, right? And the ways that people are differently positioned within this racial hierarchy, right? Including some of the economic and other racialized privileges that they have in order for solidarity to be something meaningful, right? And, it was Jackie Alexander, a Caribbean feminist, who said, and I'm, paraphrasing this, but basically we're not born women of color, right? We become women of color through knowing each other's histories. And so knowing that history and knowing how we're differently positioned within these, these racialized structures, right, is a very important part. I think, various panelists have already said that, but that's a really instrumental part of building meaningful and thick solidarities.
I think I might just chime in to say that, in terms of building what Roseann was saying, meaningful and thick solidarities, I think it's really important for us to understand solidarity as a process, right? Not as a finished product that's already there and all we need to do is inhabit it, right? I think about solidarity as something that's always in process, it's always in the process of becoming. So, for example, the construct of Asian American itself is a form of solidarity, right? It's an incredibly fragile form of solidarity because Asian Americans are such a heterogeneous group. So too for Black communities, right? What it means to be Black is differently experienced by people who come from different immigrant histories, different regions of the United States, outside the United States, etc. Right? So we know this. And yet we invoke these terms as if they're already coherent constructs. So I think that when we're speaking about solidarity, we have to really understand that solidarity is something that comes through our recognition of the kinds of histories that Roseann is speaking about, right? It comes through our knowledge of those histories. It comes through our identification across these difficult and painful histories, right? And it's in a constant process of collaboration. And sometimes it's very ephemeral and fragile. And therefore, I think solidarity is like important work to do because it's so easy to let that disappear, right? So like a film I often think about in terms of Black and Asian solidarities is Mira Nair's Mississippi Masala. I don't know how many of you know this movie, and I really recommend you watching it. It's from 1991, so it's a really kind of old movie, but it's a good one. It's actually one of the only films that I know, only mainstream film that I know that depicts interracial romance between South Asian American woman and a Black man. Sarita Chaudhry and Denzel Washington. And so it's done, yeah. And if you want to watch another movie with Denzel Washington, I highly recommend it. So, I just want to like talk about that movie for a second because it's really interesting. It came out in the early 1990s, and a movie like that hasn't been made again since then, right? It's about a South Asian woman who falls in love with a Black man in Mississippi. The woman's family are refugees from Uganda. They were part of the British colonial empire in Uganda, small business owners in Uganda who were expelled from Uganda under Idi Amin, who said Africa was for Africans, Black Africans. So they moved from Uganda to London, from London to Mississippi. When they came to Mississippi, they became small business owners again. They ran a liquor store and a motel. And then were in conversation and contact with Black communities there. But when the protagonist of that, when the young woman, Sarita Chaudhry, meets and falls in love with Denzel Washington, it becomes taboo on so many levels, right? Because not just because Denzel Washington is Black American, but because his very being evokes for them this very painful experience of being expelled from their homeland, Uganda. Right. So then part of what the movie is trying to figure out is like, how do we think about these different histories of empire and colonization? And what does that mean in the crafting of new solidarities in the United States? Right. So these are really difficult histories for us to dwell on, to think about and untangle.
Thank you for all of that. I want to ask, you mentioned that like solidarity is a process, right? And we're talking about all these different histories that groups are bringing to the table that causes this tension. So what does solidarity look like, right? When it's not becoming, when it is, what does that look like? Maybe there's a situation or there's something that we can point to that shows us that like, ideally, this is what solidarity looks like. I don't know if y'all have thought about that, but I'm also thinking with this question too, Themis, as I think about it, you mentioned, right, that you would sort of have to, and we use the conglomerate Asian American, and you talked about the model minority myth, that you would sort of have to like abandon that idea, right? And like really take ownership of what it does it mean to take advantage of, to really own this model minority myth and express that throughout your moving in the States, right? And so is that the type of work it requires, right? When I think about solidarity and the community I live in now, which is still the community I grew up, to me, it's like, okay, Asian Americans own a disproportionate number of stores in the neighborhood I live in. So I'm like, if there's real solidarity, then like now you're no longer exploiting my community, but you're thinking like, how do we work through more Black ownership in the community in which you live? Because like the Asian Americans that own businesses don't live in my community. Like, does it look like now I won't sell toxic things to Black people, right? And so for me and my perspective and situation where I come from, that's what I think solidarity might look like, the beginnings of that. So I'm curious what y'all think that solidarity looks like. Should I cold call or?
Yeah, no, I think Roseann should start. I'll follow after because she actually wrote an article that spoke in depth about some of the glass, right? So she probably should take this first.
Was it the radical history review article that you're talking about?
Yes.
So what I was going to say though, also before that even is, I think solidarity, at least for Asian Americans, means not cashing in on your non-Black privilege, right? So, and I think that we see that in sort of these debates and the struggle over affirmative action, right? And whether or not Asian Americans, that are being short shrifted because of affirmative action and not being able to get into places like Harvard and whatnot, right? I mean, I think at the very least, I don't know if it's quite solidarity, but I think at least the very beginning of that means thinking of solidarity as debt, right? That you are not going to cash in on your non-Black privilege, right? And and we all know, anti-Asian racism exists, right? Or maybe we don't all know that, but it does exist, right? But still taking kind of this comparative racialization lens, right? That says that, my non-Blackness is not, that I'm not going to mobilize that, right? As a way of, gaming the system or, having some advantage in the system, right? So at the very least, right? It really bothers me when, my community, like the Chinese American community, right? Asian American community are out there, protesting against things like affirmative action, right? Without realizing that, in many ways it's ultimately, I think it's doing us all harm, when that's happened. But I guess fixed solidarity is a concept that a friend and grad student friend and I wrote about and coined, and it's just the idea. I mean, I think, you know, very minimally, it's just the idea of not conflating things like anti-Asian racism and anti-Black racism, right? And it's, I think somebody had put the article, the link to it in the chat, so thank you for that. But it's you know, oftentimes when we think of solidarity, I think sometimes there's this kind of this very low-hanging fruit, like a common recourse to our shared humanity, right? It's very minimal, or it's very thin, right? It's very slim. And so I think fixed solidarity, right, means being able to do some of that comparative racialization work, right? And being able to understand these histories, right? And who privileges and who is disadvantaged from these histories and from these structural positionings.
I read an article and I forgot the author's name, and the title is "I'm Not Your Scapegoat," and it was Asians coming together from all different countries, but they came together and they were applying to, I think, either Yale or Harvard, and it was the time when this litigation was going on, right, about discrimination in affirmative action. And they talked in depth about the kind of pushback that they wanted to do as a community against this notion that you are not going to use us to degrade our Black brothers and sisters. And that was one of the first time that I saw this kind of coming together in like contemporary culture, right? Where they were just, Asian Americans were saying, absolutely not. We are not your scapegoat. Don't do that. We are fighting something else over here. And I think the author, historian Ellen Wu, her book, I think it was called The Color of Success, actually talks in depth about the ways in which Asian Americans try to feed into the narrative about the model minority myth, right? And on one hand, I understand it because it feels like a leg up. These stereotypes feel like it's, at least I'm not Black, right? At least I'm not associated with that. So I think when it comes to solidarity, Bakirathi, I think I pronounced your name correctly, you said that to the extent that we're thinking about solidarity, it is a process, not a destination. And to that, it is, I would agree, right? It's a very fragile process, but it requires a kind of trust in the community, including Asian American. It's very difficult to create and maintain that trust, right? Because there is some privilege when it comes to the ways in which Asian American can operate in the world, the United States, versus the ways African American can operate because of the ways that they're portrayed. And I mean, as a general matter, African American or Asian American do not have control over their imagery in contemporary media or just America generally. So we just kind of get what we get. So it's very difficult, I think, for us to build trust. But I thought that article, "I'm Not Your Scapegoat," was such a good example of how we can show up for each other. But yeah.
Bakirathi, is there anything you wanted to add to this, or should
No, I really appreciate this. You know, both Roseann's explication of fixed solidarity and saying about showing up for each other, right? And I'm thinking a lot about sort of, you know, I had talked about Mississippi Masala, which is from 1991, but I'm also thinking about a recent book published in 2020, which is Isabel Wilkerson's Caste, which is a really outstanding book, right? Because it's a book that is trying to connect the experience of what it means to be racialized as Black in the United States with the history of caste discrimination in India, right? Or the caste system in India. And for those of you who aren't familiar with the caste system, it is something that, so India is nominally a secular nation, but it's a Hindu majority nation. And one of the tenets of Hinduism is a social hierarchy, which is based on occupation. You're born into it. It's not something that you can like change, right? So if you're Hindu, you are born into a particular caste, and the caste system, which was also amplified by the British. So again, like I just want to say, it's not just Hindu, it's also connected to like these histories of colonialism, British colonialism. The caste system kind of rigidly defined who could be what. And in Wilkerson's book, she talks about Dalit activism in India. So Dalits are people who were considered to be so low on the social hierarchy that they were out of caste, right? Historically, Dalits in India have done work like leather tanning. So cows are sacred in Hinduism. And so, creating leather, skinning the hides of cows is seen as unclean work. Or they were night soil workers, like they were porters for, human waste. So Dalit communities in India have been, across the 19th and 20th century, really mobilizing against their oppression within this systematic hierarchy. And what Wilkerson's book talks about is what are the kinds of cross connections that we can build between Dalit activism in India and Black activism in the United States, right? As many of you might know, within Asian communities and specifically within South Asian communities, colorism has a long and prevalent history. So Dalits are often seen as less than or other to Hindus who are like in the majority positions of power. So this is a kind of a long way of saying that when we talk about showing up for each other, when we talk about like building thick solidarity, I think it's really worth understanding how do we build more nuanced understandings of these kinds of comparative frameworks across different national histories. I think when we think about like Black and Asian solidarity, we're so focused on the United States, like as if the United States is the only place where this is possible. But it's not. Right? Like we are actually like, we should think about like Black and Asian labor solidarity in Britain in the 1950s and 60s, right? Punjabi immigrants and immigrants came at the same time and built lives there. What did that look like, right? We should think about, South Asian indentured workers and, enslaved Africans in the Caribbean, both of whom were brought there by British colonialism. What does that solidarity look like? Right? If we can learn from those histories of 19th and early 20th century solidarity, Black Asian solidarity, I think we'll get to a model of like what solidarity can look like in the 21st century.
The sort of event that took place with Letitia Harlan, right? That story coming out of California, and then subsequent to that, the riots, right? The LA riots. I think when I try to think about kind of how can we look outside of the United States to model the kinds of togetherness, right? And thick solidarity, to use your phraseology. When we think about how to do that, I think it is very difficult when I think about it happening in the United States. And part of the difficulty comes from this is something I've said before, but distancing oneself from perceived privilege, right? And take on the mantle of I'm going to stick with a community, and we're going to fight together, as opposed to, well, at least I'm not them. So I think that is a very hard thing to do for any group. So I'm not going to blame. But also, this is separate, but hopefully tangentially related. There should be, and I just grew into this, like I didn't even think about it, but there should be a kind of, not deference, but respect to African Americans, particularly when we're talking about the ability to maneuver the US as a minority, because born out of the Civil Rights Movement was the Civil Rights Act of 1965, right? And the reason I can't be fired for being Black, or someone can't be fired for being Asian, is because of this, right? And I think a lot of the time we get lost in, well, Black people aren't doing well, or Asian people are doing the best. And but we are here, myself being an immigrant, on the backs of the work of Black people in America, right? And whenever I say that, I think a lot of people in discussion gets like, oh my God, no, why are you bringing that? But it is true, like, and some kind of appreciation for the hard work and death and the use of Black bodies to create a system where now you can maneuver, I think deserves some kind of appreciation. And I don't think African Americans get it. And I got attacked a while back because I was talking about sort of the community and how we can develop the community. And people just said, well, You're an immigrant. You came here on our backs. And I had to really think about, how do I show appreciation, but also try to be one with and move forward in that solidarity? So just something to think about, I think, but that's it.
I feel like you all brought something that was like light bulbs for me. And so I'm going to try to narrow it down to one thing to move the conversation. So Meredith had this comment in here, and some of you touched on it too, where she said Asian is so vague too, like even just using that term Asian, because in the US people think of Chinese, and then she says in the UK people think of Indian. And so just even as we think about like global solidarity and like these terms being fragile, like you all have mentioned, where it's like not even something concrete that is expressed globally. And so now I'm thinking, the point I want to bring us to is, do you think it's possible to have this like cross solidarity when as a group of like Black people or Asians, you haven't even worked out like your own shit? Because I'm like, Bakirathi, as you were giving that example, it made me think, right, that by using terms Asian and Black, you kind of like lose the point too that anti-Blackness exists within these groups, right? Like the darker your skin, right, the more oppression you might face within people that are so-called within your own identity marker. And then also within our groups, you'll have people who actually love participating in white supremacy for like what it gives them, right? Especially if your complexion is fairer, you're closer to white supremacy, and you know that I can get this and that. And so how can there really be cross solidarity when all of that is going on within these groups? Because I know some Black people that are like, respect to the Asian community, y'all get that bill passed, but Black people still don't have a bill passed. So I'm just going to focus on me and like my people until we can work this out and like really weed out the people who are holding us back, who have this attachment to white supremacy, right? So do you think it's possible to like really have this cross solidarity if you haven't even resolved what's going on within?
Quickly, I do. Fred Hampton, the Rainbow Coalition was in full effect, and the FBI decided absolutely not, right? So to the extent that we don't have intervention from the powers that be, I think that it is possible, but it's going to take a lot of leaps of faith. I think think it's possible. I think it is unlikely in the near future, but I think so. I think one of the things that we have to do is figure out a way to control our imagery, because separately, when I was in China, I realized a lot of people, people are like, oh, that is racist. And for me, it wasn't racism, it was ignorance, right? Like never being exposed to anyone Black in some of these areas, and then having the media tell you what Blackness is. I do think we have to control our image more, both Asians, I'm using the category, I apologize, and Black people, but that's it.
Either of you, Roseann, or I'm gonna, before you hop in, people are actually putting some comments in the chat right now, so I just wanna shout out quickly the people who are engaging, and then have you hop in. So Daniela says, and what about people who have peak privilege in their home countries and come here with those same attitudes, even as POC? And then Aleja, love Themis when you touch on this sentiment, at least I'm not Black, right? And then, and I'm sorry if I'm pronouncing anyone's name incorrectly, but I think this is Keisha maybe, who said that she was just thinking that along this question, that our communities are fighting amongst each other too. Once again, obstacles and hurdles that we keep tripping over. Oh, Aleja. Okay, thank you. Yes, and then I'll include one last comment. Riel says, my experience in China has changed since I started going in high school. The change of perception had a lot to do with access to media of Black people. So Themis also hitting on that imagery. I just wanted to include those comments before Roseann or Bakirathi, you hopped in.
I just want to make like a quick point about this really urgent desire to see solidarity, but also a real urgent desire to see representation of solidarity, right? And I'm just thinking of like my own Netflix feed. So my Netflix algorithms are really attuned to the fact that I like to see Asian American representation, right? So like I have show after show that is full of Asian Americans or from Asia, right? None of those shows feature Black people. So one of the really interesting things about like looking for representation is that we also want to look at representation that is across people of color, right? We don't get to see that often enough, which is why I have to think back to like 1991 to think about a movie that represents like interracial romance, between communities of color, because what we so often see is like Asian and white, right? Like, so from several years ago, Mindy Kaling's first series, the Mindy Project, she was like constantly falling in love with white men. Like that's a kind of trope, right? Even within like Asian American popular representation. I think
Stop watching that show for that point. I just was like, I cannot like. I liked Mindy originally, but I just was like, this is just traumatizing. I can't even watch this anymore.
Yeah, I mean, maybe not only for you, but for many others, right? Like it's an experience of trauma because it's also disassociated from real life. Like in real life, lots of people fall in love with lots of other kinds of people. Do you know what I mean? But we don't actually get to see that on screen. Why is that? So, so I think in terms of popular media representation, we don't see these like Black and Asian solidarities because, I don't know, because it's so compartmentalized, you like Asian programming, okay, you get to see only Asians. You like Black programming, you get to see only Black people, right? You like LGBTQ programming, you're going to see that. So our worlds become more distinct, but in real life, I don't think that's always actually the case. I'll turn it over to Roseann.
Yeah, so I'll answer the question, I guess, in a way that's a little bit orthogonal, but I remember there was this scholar who, I don't remember what the program was, but he was saying, he was basically kind of bashing anti-racism work, and not, so more as someone left of anti-racism, right? So saying basically, it wasn't quite casting aspersions, but he was very cynical, right, or doubtful about the work of anti-racism and forwarding, advancing this idea that, we need to just politically pummel the opponent, right? I think it was like, I don't know if it was those exact words, but basically the solution was just like, we just have to win politically, right? And, and I don't know, for me, it's not that I don't think that there are important critiques to some of the anti-racism work, right? Which I guess, many people talk about how, it just really kind of reduces things to kind of the individual level. But I also have a really hard time imagining what kinds of political mobilizations and what kind of like broad scale changes we can create, right? Without doing some of that anti-racism work, right? How do we politically win and pummel, right? Or I don't that's a little bit masculinist, I think, but how do we politically win, right? Without doing some of that work. And I think for me, especially, I guess, as a professor of education studies, right? If I didn't think that education was something that was possible, right? Then I'd be out of a job or I'd just be a fraud, right? And so I don't know. So I would like to think that, while I think that we do have work to do, within our own communities, however we want to, organize or categorize that and, whatever political identities we have around that, I do think that there is possibility, right, for cross-racial solidarities.
Here, because I think there's like one big possibility for cross-racial solidarity, which we're not talking about, which is Kamala Harris. She's Black and Asian, right? She's Vice President of the United States. So there's something really interesting going on where like a Black and Asian woman has become Vice President of the United States, but that symbolic marriage of Black and Asian solidarity isn't enough for us to feel like solidarity is represented.
And that's super interesting because I think for a lot of people, India is excluded from Asia when we talk about it. Someone said it in the US, where if the only thing you think about in the UK having gone there, it's quite interesting because
I mean,
Sorry, go ahead.
I'm just speaking as like an Indian woman who I was raised in Japan. So I totally identify as Asian, right? So
Yeah.
India is part of Asia, whatever. So is Japan and China and so many other countries in between. So I'm just thinking like, so why is it that when Kamala Harris, whose father was an immigrant from the Caribbean and her mother was, an immigrant from India, right? That is like 30 years before Mississippi Masala, they met and got married. They met in a Marxist reading group. They met in an anti-colonial educational setting, right? So isn't that, I mean, they got divorced, but setting that aside, like, isn't that an example?
It's actually interesting because somebody just put in the comments, this is Thomas, yeah, also Vice President recently said America is not a racist country. And so it's interesting that you bring Kamala, right? Because a lot of, and I'll use the term like foundational Black Americans here, are not in alignment with Kamala, right? And I think it hits to that point of you have people within your group who are attached to white supremacy. And so just like that, still that tension where it's like, what does Kamala really represent? What did Obama really represent? Because I'm like, there's also a lot of foundational Black Americans that are like, Obama didn't do shit for Black people. And so it's just, I feel like it's so complex to have this person set up, right? Where some people see them as a model and like symbolic, and other people are like, this is exactly what we don't want.
So,
sorry, I just want to say one thing because I realize I'm not saying that Kamala Harris is a solution. I'm just saying that she's out there, right?
Oh yeah, no, I totally got that from you.
But I also want to say one of the interesting things about Kamala Harris is that her grandfather was an Indian civil servant under British rule, and he worked with, as an emissary of the British in southern Rhodesia, which is now Zimbabwe. So there is a much longer history before Kamala Harris of like South Asian Black relations, and thinking about her grandfather as an emissary of the colonial state in Africa, right? Even though he was brown too.
So I was waiting to add this because there is a kind of rejection of Kamala. There is a rejection in a way that talks about her lack of aidosness, right? And African Americans, particularly, I don't know if it's majority, but a very loud minority, if not a majority, talks about her as if she is somehow taking up space that she should not be taking up in her identity as both Black and Asian. It is actually a quite fascinating story. Like if you go through YouTube and blogs and articles about this, I mean, I find it fascinating.
I do too. So I asked the audience to submit some questions, and they submitted so many that were so good. But unfortunately, we don't have time for them. So I'm actually just gonna like randomly kind of pick them. So let me see. So how about I just spit some out, and then maybe we can choose one. So somebody wants, Daniela brought about how can we show up for each other outside of the traumatic events that mobilize us. Miranda says, how do you confront the Asians who focus on Black on Asian crime and the stereotype that crime is Black? I feel like this conflict isn't rooted in one community of color deliberately targeting another. It began with a lack of investment from the city, putting communities of color in conflict with each other. And then we have also talking about the dismissal of state violence against underclass Asians, particularly Southeast Asians, as an acceptance to Asians as a whole, reinforces stereotype that state violence against Blacks is the norm and that crime is Black. So that's a continuation of that earlier question. So that's, and then it was one more question about how, despite othering, what do you think about the strong influence on each other? Like Black people like anime, or Asians listen to Western music. That's so, my brother loves anime. And then there's so many Asian identities that are brown people and don't get to hop on that model minority train. And I'm so happy you highlighted that too, because we had been talking a lot about the model minority myth in this conversation today, and that definitely needed to be said. So those were a lot of questions. Are there any that like kind of jumped out to you? I just wanted to give space because I asked people for questions, so I wanted to put them out there. So maybe we can wrap up by each of you kind of addressing a question that jumped out to you.
I'll address the question, or I think it's more just the point that was made about, let me see if I could find it, about the lack of the divestment in communities of color. You know, so that's something that, I mean, I think it's familiar to all Americans, right? But in Philadelphia, the school district of Philadelphia has been, you know, perennially underfunded for a very, very long time, right? And so in South Philly, where there are large populations of Black and Asian Americans, there was a conflict at South Philly High a number of years ago, maybe, I don't know, at this point, maybe even 10 years ago. And so, you know, I think that this, you know, so I just want to agree with this point, right? That a lot of that conflict, right? Though I'm not sure all of it, but a lot of that conflict, right? I think we can trace back to just the divestment from schools, right? From urban public schools, that creates a situation where everybody's fighting each other, right? For scraps, right? And so I just want to kind of underscore this point that that Miranda made about how divestment from these communities of color really creates a wedge between communities.
I will speak to this idea of tying Blackness to crime, right? And then how to get rid of that. Well, not how to get rid of that, but a comment on it. If I knew how to get rid of it, it would be gone. I think we are not great stewards of history, at least on a personal level. And I think that when we think about the gold rush and the expansion of the railroad, the stereotypes about Black people and degeneracy generally, right? Whatever you think, disease, criminality, all of that, those were associated with Asians during this time, right? And it's one of those things where, like, if you are invested in media at all, whether it be printed or televised, you realize that none of this is new, right? We got to reframe some of the imagery, a lot of the imagery on Asian America in the 1940s onward, right? Again, said this before, but that was part of a geopolitical movement, right, to gain allyship, right? So that's part of it. And now we have Black people being named some of the very same things that Asian people were named. And none of it, at the time, it wasn't right, but it's not completely inaccurate in that, like, the problem with stereotypes is not that it doesn't fit an individual in the community, it's that it's incomplete, right? Like, you cannot use that as a blanket statement for everyone in the community. And I think once we get to that point where we recognize that, conspiracy theory, we're being controlled, and what to think. I think we can get over that hump, but that's all I have to say on that.
As we've run out of time, so I'm just going to say two things. The first about there's anime, but then there's also K-pop. All my students watch and listen to K-pop, so I just want to say what is going on with that, and is there maybe something really interesting in terms of solidarity in popular culture? But the second thing I want to say in relation to how we might not be good stewards of our history is, so let's try and create some space to learn about it, right? Let us try and think about, okay, what are the histories that constitute who we are as racialized subjects, as minorities in this country, no matter how we identify? You know, what are the ways in which we're constituted by histories that are larger than the histories that we learn about in this country? Right? I have a little kid who's in 3rd grade. The only history he's learning about is the history of the United States over and over and over again. But there are histories that are larger than the history of this country that might point the way to some of the solidarities that we're looking for, right? Like, one place to start could be the 1955 Bandung Conference, which was all about Afro-Asian solidarity. It was all about non-alignment, fighting imperialism together. So why don't we start there?
I love how we ended that, because I feel like that's just so accurate, right? Like, starting with history, starting with education, and just all the ways we've been miseducated through media, right? Which we've just been talking about this whole time and thinking about who constructs this media. You said conspiracy theory. I say truth facts. When you think about the source of everything you've learned, right? Who is it coming from? And more often than not, it's coming from the group that has oppressed all of us the world over. And so really taking that time to relearn and create spaces for that. I want to give respect to the next panel, because I know how it feels to start your session And the only people viewing are like the moderator and the panelists. I want to thank Riel for inviting all of us to be on this panel today. I want to thank y'all for working with me through these questions. It was a really, I think, hard conversation to have that I don't think that people have often, like outside of like academy and things like that. So this is a really great conversation. I want to thank our audience for all your comments and questions. That was awesome. I'm sorry that we didn't get to go in depth into all of them. But we have these bookmarked, and I know Riel is going to share the video later, and I'm sure have some forthcoming information.